I speak a lot about tradition and traditionalism a lot on this channel, so I thought I'd make a video explaining exactly what I mean by those terms. While you could refer to English or Christian tradition, these things aren't necessarily part of traditionalism. Traditionalism is probably best understood as an all-encompassing mystical movement with right-wing leanings. If you can imagine a hippie with right-wing and conservative views, which I know sounds like a contradiction, you're in the right ballpark of understanding what a traditionalist is. It's why me and my wife have a joke that my views could be described as hippie fascist. It's a joke, Stasi, it's a joke. I'm not intending to reawaken the Third Reich or anything. Now, when exploring traditionalism, it isn't easy to offer simple definitions. That's because the key thinkers vary in their religions, their outlook, their politics, and so on, but they do have generic things in common, so let's start with those. There's been an interest in traditionalism in recent years because many people feel the West is coming to an end. It's in a state of decline, if you will. And this is something that traditionalism has been saying for 100 years. It's generally opposed to modernity, far from the prevailing view, which views modernity as hyper-scientific and hyper-rational and leading to a better world rooted in progress. Traditionalism warns that we're coming to the end of a cycle. We're moving into a state of decadence and losing our soul and the essential truths that hold societies together. In essence, where modernity prefers verifiable facts and figures, traditionalism aims towards eternal truths, mythologies, and symbolic wisdom. Where modernity tends to edge towards industry and money, traditionalism points towards hierarchy and devotion. Where modernity is in the material, traditionalism is in the spirit. Now, while traditionalism is generally associated with the right wing, a lot of these things I just mentioned don't sound too right wing, do they? In fact, some of the stuff like anti-capitalism sounds more left wing. And this is explained because traditionalism is bigger than modern day political ideologies. They'd see ideologies part of modernism developing after the 1800s anyway. In essence, in modernity, we tend to think in terms of political ideologies to explain the world, but traditionalists tend to think in civilizational terms. This is best expressed by what's known as the perennial philosophy. Now, the spiritual godfather of traditionalism, a Frenchman named René Guénon, was very involved in perennialism, and I've used this handy diagram before to show what's meant by traditional thought. As you can see at the top, you have the experience of God, the absolute. This isn't an intellectual thing, this is an experience, and this is a contemplative, mystic reality which lays at the birth of any civilization or culture. Of course, you could say Jesus, Muhammad, or Buddha acted these contemplative forms that the prophets may commune with in contemplative experience. Now, as you can see with the contemplative forms, it states the similarities here are more apparent. And that's something I experienced in my own spiritual journey. I started as an atheist like most Westerners, had a spiritual experience, and then got into the more Eastern flavoured religions. They're more accessible. And then I started reading the dialogues between Thich Nhat Hanh, the Buddhist monk, and Thomas Merton, the Catholic mystic. Now, these two figures both ended up writing books about the other's religions and how they found deep similarities in the contemplative practices. However, such outlooks and experiences tend to be limited to an exclusive spiritual elite. Many people just think it's nonsense. However, when you look over time, you do see these figures are quite prophetic and they do form the basis of many civilizations and cultures. In time, their thought gets institutionalized, as we can see in the graph here. As you might expect, when this mystic truth becomes institutionalized, it gets particularized. A Christian goes to church, a Buddhist goes to temple, a Muslim goes to mosque. And in that institutionalization, it brings on the specifics of a culture. Yes, it informs the moral basis of a given culture, but it also takes on the specifics of a people. Now, you can see this phenomenon develop in Europe with the more Germanic Europeans developing a Protestant Christianity and the more southern Romantic Europeans sticking with Catholicism. This also crudely maps onto tomato and potato Europe, the staple of diets in northern and southern Europe. Again, it's an expression of different food, different weather systems, different people, different cultural practices. Now, generally speaking, traditionalists will recognise the uniqueness of a given people, their right to their own land and so on, but at the same time it will embrace other forms and practices. René Guénon himself, for instance, became a Muslim. He viewed Islam as one of the only lasting traditions left in the Western world. Further, while many in the West who embrace traditionalism are strongly nativist, they do embrace thought from other traditions as well, namely Hinduism. This is especially prevalent in the Hindu understanding of history, which tends to think in cycles over linear progress in the Western model. Many, but not all, traditionalists will point to the Hindu yugas, that translates roughly as ages. At the moment, so the thought goes, we're in what's known as the Kali Yuga. Now again, crudely speaking, ages represent different timescales in a given civilizational cycle. We start with the Golden Age, that's where you have the mystics, the shamans, the priestly class come to the fore. That's followed by the Silver Age, where you have the development of the honourable warrior, he who fights for good cause. Then you have the Bronze Age. This is largely led by the merchant. It's where the money class starts to take power. And finally that descends into the Dark Age. This is where we are today, so the theory goes. This is where you have mass society, the mass man. Here we've entered a state of materialism, decadence, and ultimately decay. It's where our art starts getting uglier, where people don't really have a sense of meaning anymore. And it's the precursor to the civilizational death and rebirth. This is something I obviously speak a lot about on the channel. Now, some of you may be thinking this is interesting and all, but we haven't touched on what gives modern traditionalism its edginess, and that largely comes from Julius Evola, sometimes referred to as the world's most right-wing thinker. Julius Evola was a disciple of René Guénon, yet took traditionalism into much more hard-right waters. Evola was an unashamed elitist and aristocrat, and he intended only to be read by a select few in that same mould. He thought traditionalism could be used for a sort of European reawakening. He believed strongly in hierarchical structures, such as spirituality over materialism, masculinity over femininity. He even had racial hierarchies. They're not so much biological in the sort of Hitlerian fashion, but more in a spiritual model, and you had to be initiated into them as well. Given his embrace of hierarchy and elitism, Evola strongly opposed the mass democracy of the age, viewing it as decadent. He viewed capitalism and communism as flip sides of the same materialist coin. He thought secularism had taken over the true divine nature of life. Now, as you might imagine, given the time frame that Evola was around, there are many claims that he was very influential on Italian and even German fascism. However, this is also counterclaimed by the fact that fascism essentially itself was a modernist ideology, and Evola was only trying to bring Italian, not German fascism, back into traditionalist lines, something he never succeeded with. Now, Evola actually critiqued fascism in his work, Fascism Viewed from the Right. Now, anybody who's actually read into fascism beyond Guardian headlines will be aware that many on the right are wary often of fascism because of its innate populism. It incorporates elements of leftism, socialism. Obviously, the Nazis were national socialists, and it has a sort of mass energy, a modernist energy, that traditionalists who are more rooted in hierarchy and elitism, like Evola, wouldn't be very keen on. Now, there are figures on the radical right who view Evola as a sort of spiritual godfather, but then there are more generic traditionalists who would view him as too right-wing, too elitist, and too political, and so on. Now, this is just a quick and oversimplified overview of traditionalism. I should say there are a host of other thinkers and practices involved here, figures deeply embedded in the Islamic, the Hindu, the Christian, especially the Orthodox, and to an extent Catholic, and the pagan traditions. As I stated at the beginning, it's hard to put traditionalist thinkers into one basket. Many have different outlooks, different political beliefs, and so on. But for those interested, my own beliefs tend to veer towards René Guénon and a sense of universal, mystical truth, discernible only by few. They act as, if you like, the civilization starters. I broadly say I agree with the cyclic theory of history as well. I do think civilizations and peoples die and are reborn. I also think the institutionalization of mystical truths is important for a people and a culture to hold it together. That's why I hold to conservative Christian belief in my day-to-day life. Also, holding to Christian and traditionalist belief is seen as a contradiction by some in traditionalist circles. Evola himself was anti-Christian, largely taking notes from Nietzsche in that regard. René Guénon saw value in the Christian tradition but thought it had all but died out. That's why he embraced Islam. Further to that, many who embrace traditionalism in the modern day tend to view Christianity with suspicion, as they view it as a corrupted tradition now, or one that doesn't stem or emanate from Europe or European people. A lot of those folks tend to embrace forms of paganism. Now, I would agree that Christianity has largely been corrupted in the West. It's very stale if you go to a church, yet I do believe its mystical heart is still beating. This is exactly what Scott Mannion and I spoke about when I interviewed him. He's a Christian mystic who's definitely worth listening to and very well informed and knowledgeable on these issues. I'll link that down below if you want to check it out. As I often state, this is what I'm aiming to build my Substack towards. I'm aiming for it to be a resource for men where they can have an oasis away from modernity, find deeper meaning, go on journeys of self and collective transformation. All of that's coming down the line as I build it out throughout the next few months. So do check that out and join down below if you're interested. Other than that, do let me know your thoughts and consider subscribing to the channel if you're new. Do have a good rest of the day.